All right. Well, I'm really excited to introduce you all to John Dawes. John has been a legend in the marketing community, certainly on LinkedIn as of the last year or so, more so. But I know you've been a record long marketing leader and in the academic world for more than I think 30 years at the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute, and then before that. But welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me and looking forward to the chat.
So I think I want to just jump right into it. And I know that most of this conversation, I want to spend time talking about the 95/5 rule. And I think recently it seems like on LinkedIn, for whatever reason, there's a lot of people that are talking about it right now.
Yeah.
And I think what I wanted to do is just shed a light on the person who actually came up with this rule, or you might say heuristic, right? Or rule of thumb, not an exact precise rule,
Yes.
and kind of talk about how we calculated, where the origin of it was, et cetera. But I'd like to start maybe, the origin of it, right? So what was the ultimate, reason you decided to even come up with a rule like this? What was the story
Mm.
around that?
Yes. So the story around it is, I mean, in a sense, I can't really claim credit for it because the it's not necessarily kind of entirely new knowledge. So, for example, we've known for many decades that, um, particularly with say consumer goods markets, our namesake Andrew Ehrenberg back in the 1950s documented the distribution or what you can call the spread of consumer purchases over a time period. Okay, so typical say consumer goods category, it follows a particular shape. There's like lots and lots of people who don't buy, and then of the people who do buy, there's like lots of 1 and 2 time buyers, and then fewer kind of 5, 6, 7 time buyers, and then hardly any heavy buyers, buying 12, 13 times a year or whatever. And that pattern or shape is called the negative binomial distribution.
Mm.
And one of Ehrenberg's big contributions was to show that the distribution of purchases follows like a known statistical distribution, which is hugely useful. Um,
Mm.
Now, of course, that's straightforward. We can extrapolate from that and say, well, yeah, like certainly in consumer goods, a lot of buyers are not in the market, even in so-called fast-moving consumer goods. A lot of households, a lot of people don't buy, in a quarter or 6 months or even in a year. And then secondly, doing research work with sponsors of Ehrenberg-Bass, who are B2B sponsors, reviewing, for instance, reviewing marketing documents and examining what those were, strategy documents for review and stuff. Sorry, actually, we'll have to edit that out. That's not coming across very well.
Oh, good.
Um, so second, work with commercial sponsors of the Ehrenberg Bass who are B2B sponsors. We were noticing, for instance, in reviewing things like survey results, that if they asked B2B clients, have you done a particular thing lately? Like, have you reviewed your supplier list or have you entered the market and you know, um, sent out tenders for supply and so on? A lot of respondents would say, no, they haven't. And so that again told us there are a lot of B2B clients who aren't in the market in any particular time period. And then the third factor is, this long-standing debate about advertising effects. Why does advertising have such weak effects on sales? There's been a debate for 50 odd years about why is it that, if you drop price, there's a big effect on sales. Whereas if you turn advertising on, not much happens to sales. And of course, the explanation for that is that most of the advertising is hitting people who are not necessarily in the market right now. So of course, it
Mm.
can't have strong sales effects. Its effects will play out over a much longer time period. And so
Right.
what we simply did, or what I did, was to come up with a catchy title, which is 95/5, which simply says that, like the vast majority of potential buyers are not in the market. And depending on what precise time frame you look at, it does actually often work out to around about 95/5.
Right. It's so interesting. To your point, this goes way back to when, but yes, you seem to get a lot of the credit around this rule. But I actually heard a similar heuristic from a guy by the name of Chet Holmes, who wrote The Ultimate Sales Machine back in, I believe it was 2007. I want to say, I'll have to double check that. But it was basically a book about all things sales process and frameworks, et cetera. But he stood up in front of a group of people, and
Hmm.
there were around, I think, 1,000 or 2,000 people in the crowd. And the question he asked them is, he said, "How many people are in market to buy a house right now?" And about 3% roughly of the people in the audience actually raised their hand and said, "Yes, like I'm actually in the market. I'm looking for a house right now, et cetera, et cetera." And
Right.
he did this with a variety of questions, all sorts of different products, right? I think it was houses, cars. I mean, those things, of course, you don't buy often, right? Those are, every 10, 20, 30 years, maybe in some cases.
Yeah.
But other products that even have a shorter inter purchase time period, like we'll talk about here in a little bit. And so that was actually my first introduction to even thinking about it. I mean, it's an obvious thing when you take a step back, right? I mean, even something as simple as toothpaste, right? That everyone can relate to, as you've got a couple of tubes of toothpaste in your house, well, it's likely that you're not in the market or going to buy another tube of toothpaste until they run out, unless you just like
Yes.
to, use coupons and, stockpile toothpaste in your house, which is unlikely.
That's
But I
right.
think that's so interesting where that originated from.
Yeah. And, what a surprising fact for marketers who operate in those sorts of markets is it really is often quite a surprise to look at the proportion of households who are only buying a few times a year. Like you'd
Right.
easily think, for instance, I don't know, like we did a study many, many years ago on loaf bread,
Hmm.
sliced bread. And, you'd be tempted to think, well, most people would buy that every week. But the
Right.
average purchase interval for white bread is only about 25 times a year.
Right.
And out of that, it's kind of weighted up by a long tail of heavy buys. There's a huge number of households who only buy something like bread a few times a year, which has
Right.
big marketing implications. That our marketing activity is going to hit a lot of people who are extremely light buyers of the category, which then casts into doubt a lot of marketing folklore about strong emotional bonds to brands and things like that, which seems a little bit more fantastical when they're only buying them quite infrequently.
Right. Exactly. 100%. Well, so then I guess the next clear question is like, all right, well, how do you calculate it?
Yeah.
And I think from reading your blog back, I think in 2021, it seems pretty straightforward, but maybe just to rehash it a little bit for people and what variables get involved, and how you calculate them would be good to better understand for everyone.
Yes. So let's take a typical example, a B2B brand with a 3-year interpurchase period. In other words, the average buyer comes in and purchases once every 3 years. So
Great.
if we simply start off by saying, well, how many are in the market in a year, which will be a third,
Mhm.
and then how many in a quarter? Well, that's a quarter of 33. So something about 8% in a quarter or around 2 to 3% a month or something like that. So really simple, basic arithmetic. Um, Now, another contributor to this and many other interesting debates on LinkedIn, Dale Harrison suggests that if you want to know more precisely, like if you're using this, as a specific kind of forecasting tool, then you may want to take into account the length of time that a client is in market, right? So, in theory, with the example that I just said, so if there's 2 to 3% coming into the market each month, and
Mhm.
they each take another month to evaluate suppliers, then in a sense, in any given month, it's not 2 to 3, it's actually 4 to 6, right? That's true.
Right.
But my impression is it doesn't take that long for clients to work out their shortlist. And then once they've worked out a shortlist, from the point of view of advertising strategy, they're kind of out of the market. So to me, I think it's probably enough to just think about the average interpurchase interval and then work out the resultant proportions for a time period, like a month or a quarter, something like that.
Right, right. So the variables we have at play are the inter purchase time period, which is how frequently someone buys said product category, like toothpaste or CRM software or email marketing tool, et cetera.
Yes.
And then you've got the other one that you mentioned, which would be more like sales cycle length, I suppose, or the time of which
Yeah,
I
the
decided I
actual
have a problem, I've identified it, and now I'm going to start looking for tools out there, right? And trying to factor that into the calculation, which sounds like you lean a little bit more towards not going that direction, making it so complex and just leaving it pretty simple and straightforward and saying, hey, listen. If we
Yes.
generally know how often someone buys said product category, we're going to get pretty darn close. Things are
Yeah.
typically not going to take that long. Is that kind of the takeaway there?
Yes, to me, because I mean, my reason for popularizing this idea uh, wasn't so much to create a actual like a sales forecasting tool or anything like that. It was just to as a way to communicate a really important concept, which
Yeah.
is that the vast majority of potential buyers are not on the market right now. Whether it's exactly 95/5 or whether it's 90/10 or 88/12, to me, that doesn't matter. It's a way to get an idea across to marketing teams and maybe to non-marketing people in the business that, you know, trying to explain the way in which advertising works and what we can reasonably expect in any particular time period. Like we can't expect to, you know, if we look at what our, sales force can accomplish,
Mm.
well, if there's only a proportion of potential buyers in the market in a particular period, like a month or a quarter. Well, what that means is there's kind of a cap on what our reps or what our, account management team can accomplish. They can't
Right.
they can't win sales from all of the market because not all of the market is ready to buy. And I think that's just useful sort of sensible management heuristic.
Exactly. Well, and then of course you've got the rest of the competitors that are trying to win also those same buyers too. So you're clearly not going to win even all of the people that are actually in market with that estimation. But I think your point's
Yeah.
taken. I mean, this has really been more of the way I've always seen it, the way that we talk about it with some of our clients is more of a framing exercise, really.
Yes.
And you could tell me if I'm right or wrong on that. But we typically use it not to say, hey, let's calculate the exact number of accounts that are in market in this given period and then practically think about how we then go after them with a certain type of marketing strategy. Because at the end of the day, like there isn't, as far as I know, any reliable data out there or third party data to say that these specific companies are all in market and all
Yeah.
trying to buy the software category. I mean,
Definitely not.
if we had that right and that was solved, then it would make things pretty darn easy, and we probably wouldn't, argue about these things as much, right?
Yes, yes. I mean, presumably all of these identified prospects would be, subject to an avalanche
Oh,
of
yeah.
account management and direct marketing and so on. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, so I follow you. I follow the math. So, I mean, again, the key is there to just focus on the inner purchase time period. And I think the follow up to that would be some people might ask, well, how do I figure out what my inner purchase time period is
Yes,
for my
that's a good.
product category? And I think I know you've alluded to this in the past in some other podcasts and blogs, but correct me if I'm wrong here. But I know you've said just typical good old fashioned surveys and pulling, clients together, doing questions, interviews, things of that nature, kind of the typical way that one would go about getting that data, or are there some other sources of data they could go to get that type
I
of
think
thing?
that's the main of it. I mean, there are sometimes published reports, and I think I used some examples in the original blog piece on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Um, but of course, we do have to acknowledge or recognize that, if we say the average interpurchase interval is 3 years, of course, it's not exactly three for everyone. There's heterogeneity around that. So I
Right.
think one of the, important account management functions is just being in decent enough contact with potential clients to just obviously know, well, who's going to be coming into the market in the next quarter or the next year, and
Mm.
who's out of the market for say 2 years or whatever. I mean, that's obviously one of the basic functions of a sales force is just acting as a market intelligence mechanism so that you know which accounts are going to be potentially kind of in the
Mhm.
in the kind of warm prospect stage.
Right, right. Got it. Okay, makes sense. Perfect. So surveys, interviews, asking people questions, things of that nature could give you at least some rough estimates on things. But imagine too, I wonder how, looking at even data in your CRM to look at churn and how long clients typically even stay with your service could be
Yes.
somewhat of an indicator as well. I mean, if you knew that, on average, if you're HubSpot, for example, you know that maybe people stay with you for about 3 to 4 years before moving on to Salesforce.
Right.
That maybe could be also an indicator, I would imagine too, right? Or
Indeed.
would you say? Yeah, okay. Got it. Cool. Okay. Well, so that gives some framing, I guess, for everyone on the calculation, kind of what it is and the origin of it. And then I guess the big thing I had some questions about. I know that the Ehrenberg-Bass has done a huge amount of research on mostly it seems like B2C brands, but also a lot of B2B more so. And maybe that's changed.
Yeah.
And I've been reading a whole variety of different things. But how do you think that the 95/5 rule differs for B2C versus B2B? Is there any real tangible difference in your opinion? Or they really it's just kind of the difference of, again, how frequently do people buy toothpaste versus how frequently do people buy, say, CRM software?
Yeah. The general principle still applies. I mean, B2C, there's typically a shorter interpurchase interval, for say consumer goods like, I don't know, yogurt or coffee or whatever.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but the general, but the overall principle is the same. So even if I'm a a marketer of toothpaste or coffee, um, it's useful for me to just stop and consider. Actually, yes, there's in the distribution of buyer purchases, it's weighted towards the light end. There's a huge proportion of people who are buying infrequently, and
Mhm.
likewise B2B, same principle applies, but we're talking about much longer purchase intervals of 2-3 years, things like that.
Right, right. So end of the day, it just comes back to make sure that you've got inner purchase time period calculated correctly for your product category. Simple as that.
Yes,
That makes
yes,
sense. Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I always hear people talk about, and I think it comes back to what we were talking about before, is that when you start to use this as a more precise calculation, I think that's where things get really hard, and there's pushback around things. But the
mm,
framing of it's always been really to frame the fact that many B2B SaaS brands of which we work with are spending too much of their budget on direct response performance marketing when they really should be focused more on your typical brand marketing types of campaigns. Doesn't necessarily mean like OOH or mass media. It just means campaigns not designed to immediately convert someone off of some type of offer, right? They
yes,
connect actually back to specific problem situations, or you guys might use the word category entry points,
yes,
so that ultimately when they do come in market, that they think of your brand. And as we all know, that usually, to your point, there's two, three, four brands or something that usually come to mind in a product category, especially if you're very familiar with it and it's a mature category.
yeah,
So I was kind of thinking, just curious of your thought process around some of the objections you get
yeah,
when talking about the 95/5 rule with marketers as it relates to brand marketing versus performance marketing, and some of the, just questions that kind of come up on, all right, well, how do we really do this? And,
yeah,
especially for early stage SaaS brands, it's a little bit different than I think the focus of the Ehrenberg-Bass Institute, but I'd be curious your thoughts there.
yes. Um, I would say not so much pushback, but I think if we frame this part of the discussion as, in a sense, how do marketers, like debate about how do marketers communicate the value of marketing? Like, why should senior managers allocate, you know, um, dollars to the marketing team to spend on things like advertising?
Mhm.
And so we've got 95/5, which is like a useful heuristic, but in a sense, it's kind of not enough. It needs another piece of the puzzle, I think, for things to come into clarity, which is, and actually you just mentioned it, which is, so there's a lot of potential clients who are not in the market now, but when they do come into the market, I think a key factor is small consideration sets, right? So typically, two or three potential suppliers, and often out of maybe, 50. And
Mhm.
so we have to ask ourselves, what's the key factor that will determine whether a supplier will get onto the shortlist or not? And the answer is, well, like this huge impact of whether somebody in the buying group has heard of them before,
Mhm.
or has some familiarity with them. And so we can think about it this way. Suppose I'm a small, you know, B2B marketer. Um, and I think, well, what's the big difference between me as a small brand and a market leader who's, 20 times as big?
Mhm.
Is it because we do well in kind of getting clients to consider us, but then we get knocked out at the last stage because there's some shortcoming in pricing or product quality or specs or whatever? So is that our problem? Or is the problem that we just didn't get thought of in the first place? And obviously the answer is, the reason we're small, the reason we missed out on that sale and that sale and that sale and that sale is because we didn't even get thought of it at
Yeah.
all. So that comes a pretty good rationale for what people will generally call like brand building advertising, right? You
Mhm.
have to do that so that you've built some mental availability so that you come to mind and you get onto those shortlists.
Mm.
Yeah. So the other thing that you alluded to is, um, so it's not just advertising to build memory structures for people to, to be activated when they come into the market. It's like trying to construct the right memory structures. So,
Mm.
understanding what we call category entry points. In other words, the situations and scenarios that are bringing people into the market. So if my advertising is mirroring the sorts of key buying cues and situations that people will encounter when they're coming to the market, then that's easier to link in people's minds, right? So yes,
Right.
recognize there's a huge pool of potential buyers who are not in the market. Um, if they don't know about me, I have zero chance of being considered and bought. So therefore, there's a rationale for mainstream advertising. And
Mm.
then thirdly, well, what sort of advertising? And the answer is category relevant advertising that links my brand to the various needs, wants, situations that are bringing people on the market. And then
Right.
fourthly, of course, if we think about advertising as being memory construction, then we have to really, really be careful and really diligent about making our advertising well branded because
Mm.
it has to be remembered, and it's way easier for it to be remembered and remembered for us, not somebody else, if it's
Mm.
extremely well branded. And so, my colleague Jenny Romanek has written books on distinctive assets, what we call distinctive brand assets, which are key to making your advertising memorable and ensuring that people link it to you. Because it's surprising.
Yes.
It's a surprising fact that you can do research on advertising effectiveness and you can show people unbranded bits of advertising, um, rates of only 50% brand recognition are, not that uncommon. So a lot of advertising, in a sense, not so much falls on deaf ears, but, goes perhaps in through one's eyes and doesn't reside in the brain properly because people haven't properly attached the right brand to the piece of advertising.
I love her book. I don't think you can see it on the video, but it's literally on the shelf right at the top next to me. I was reading it actually. I think it was, yeah, what is early this year, I believe. So yeah, it's a great book. I wanted to go back to your point. You made a good one on just large brands versus small brands for a second, and just kind of thinking about this because I think the natural issue that I think a lot of these early stage SaaS brands, and when I say early stage, just to define that, I mean, usually Series A to Series C have raised anywhere from like 10 to $100 million. So we're not talking about mature category leaders like Coca-Cola and just the bigs of the bigs, right? We're talking about people that still relatively don't know what they do, who they are, all sorts of things that are just not out there in the market. The category may be established, but their brand is not.
Right.
And so a lot of times the scenarios that these brands are in is that they're usually VC funded, right? The vast majority of them. They're usually unprofitable, sometimes by choice, other times just because of the nature of the beast.
Mm,
And so that means that runway, of course, is limited with usually anywhere roughly SaaStr will state the statistic last I heard is somewhere between 12 and 18 months, sometimes more or less. People probably keeping a lot more cash on hand now that capital's a lot more expensive with interest rates a lot higher and inflation trending higher, certainly in the US. But those things are really top of mind for everyone. And so I think that a lot of the CMOs and VPs of marketing out there that listen to this are thinking, it's everyone I think wants to do brand marketing or those types of really fun, creative, memorable campaigns.
mm,
But I think that so often we're just back to the same old, how do we get something right now? The typical short termism, or I believe it's the present bias, and just really thinking more about today, or the hyperbolic discount effect, I think would be probably the better term there.
yes.
Really trying to find, people that are in market right now, today, within the next quarter, where people are not so interested about thinking the next couple of quarters because one could argue they may not be in business or they may have to raise again, which could be expensive for the founders to do so. And
Yeah.
so my question is, and you're just thinking about this as it relates to bigger brands, because I know you guys have done a lot of studying with very big mature brands. Do you feel like do you feel like it's still challenging for, these younger brands to really make the impact and shifts budgets for this more so than your bigger mature brands where, I mean, a lot of these brands have been spending on mass media and brand marketing for many years, decades, right? Whereas all these
Yes.
smaller brands, it just hasn't been a thing. So I'd be curious your thoughts on that.
It's definitely the case that small brands face, somewhat of an uphill battle. It's not to say they can't grow, but they certainly face a disadvantage. And we've got a term for that. It's double jeopardy.
Right.
Small brands suffer twice. They have fewer buyers and less loyalty. And the question is, okay, why? Right? Why is double jeopardy a ubiquitous feature of markets? And the answer is, well, again, our namesake, Andrew Ehrenberg, double jeopardy will apply whenever you have, you know, competing offers that have kind of relatively equal merits, but one is known a lot more than the other. And the beautiful example was the big and small restaurant. So if you ask people who dine at one of two restaurants in a town, there's
Mm.
a big one, big popular one, and a small one that hardly anybody goes to. And you ask people, which is your favorite restaurant? Well, a lot of what you'll find is that the bigger restaurant will get a better score on most favorite restaurant, because of the people who go there, a lot of its customers don't even know about the small restaurant.
Mm.
Whereas those people who dine at the small restaurant, they also dine at the big one, and so their vote will kind of be split. So that's a,
Mm.
a, a manifestation of double jeopardy. And so, yep, small brands are battling against the greater mental and physical availability of their larger counterpart. But so
Mm.
it doesn't mean they're doomed. It just means they have to work a lot smarter. They have to deploy their marketing spend really wisely. Have to particularly make sure that they're not doing things like running advertising that's not well branded. Be really, really diligent about
Mm.
getting the category entry points right. And then I think if a small brand, is constrained with a small budget, then one big thing I think would be to say, look, we've only got a certain amount of money. We can only reach a certain number of intending clients, or indeed, create a certain number of impressions.
Mm.
Because the worst possible thing we could do is to say um, that we're spending an undue amount of money hitting the same people multiple times, which is a real sin when we've only got so much money to spend. So, for example, if I'm spending this much money, well, how many people have I managed to reach
Mm.
in the
Mm.
time period? If I can't reach them, then I can't kind of nudge their purchase propensity. But if I reach them, I can. But of course, what I don't want to be doing is hitting some people 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times with advertising messages, when the vast bulk of the rest of the market hasn't even been hit once. So there is something
Right.
to be said about being um, being diligent, being really careful to try and maximize reach while minimizing frequency. And it's especially important for small brands with limited budgets.
I read that article. It was John Lombardo's article, right? I believe from the B2B Institute that partnered with you all on that. Yeah, I think it was very interesting, and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that just logically speaking, too. I mean, the audience is always a lot bigger on the side of people that are cold, unaware, not in market, right? We've just talked about that and established that in the beginning of this call or podcast. And so, with that, you're going to have more of your budget dedicated to that because you just don't need the same amount of budget to go into people that are already aware of your brand. Let's call that retargeting, to just use an easy word. The people that have been to your website, maybe engaged with your advertising before, things that clearly can be, seen in the digital world. It's going to be a much smaller group of people, a fraction of that number. And so you're not going to need that budget. But to your point, you want to be careful how you use it still, where some people may over index on retargeting and then frequency is getting jacked up. And then you're, potentially sending the same type of offer ad or whatever the message is over and over and over again. And like, hey, these people are not ready. So why don't we worry about the bigger amount of people, which I think rolls into a very interesting thing that's been popular for years now, which is ABM. And you probably have some interesting thoughts around account based marketing, but account based marketing is just for definition's sake, not to get into all the tactics, but just how we typically define it. And I'd be curious if you define it differently. Is usually, going after a very small set of accounts, usually somewhere between like 1 and 20,
mhm,
and you're having a very personalized approach. Be personalized cold emails, doing a lot more research, might be gifting strategies, events, all sorts of things that'll be used in terms of tactics, but it's very, very specific to a small set of accounts.
mhm,
And I think to this point with the 95/5 rule, I would imagine that there's quite a bit of risk around these types of strategies, especially when there's a large amount of resources and budget put into them. Now, granted, the outcome of closing a deal at one of these accounts could be pretty big,
mhm,
but the risk is pretty large because they don't know necessarily whether these accounts are in market or not. And given that they've reduced it down to such a small pool of accounts, I
mhm.
would imagine that you would probably agree that, that's something that you would probably try to avoid or maybe have as a play that's running on the side to your kind of broader marketing strategy. How do you kind of see ABM in the world of all this?
Yeah. I mean, that strategy that you described, we have seen some instances of kind of attempts to do that, and from the data that I've seen, it doesn't tend to work. We've certainly seen, like an analogous strategy to that in, for instance, in prescription pharmaceuticals, where you'll have a a marketer that will, like, try and very tightly go after, a small group of targeted physicians.
Mm,
Doesn't seem to work. It seems to be that if you do want to grow a brand, you have to go broad. You can't grow, by targeting a small group of intending clients.
right.
It seems to just not work, because in a sense, clients that you're directing your effort towards, we have to remember that they're also exposed to other kind of marketing activity. And so if they never see or hear anything about you from anything other than, for instance, this tightly focused activity, it doesn't
Right.
seem to be enough to build memory structures to kind of reel them towards you adequately. So yeah, I think generally the idea about um, going after a small group of select accounts, I think it's risky in the sense it risks failure. Um,
Right.
it's hard to go from a small brand to a big brand by tightly targeting a small group of intending users.
I agree. I mean, it definitely has a lot of risk to it. I mean, I think the other issue too is that a lot of brands will usually run that 1 to 20 accounts for only a short amount of time, right? I mean, usually it's 3 to 6 months.
Mhm.
Usually they're not running an ABM play to the same type of account for an entire year. I've never heard of that, honestly. Maybe there's some use case out there where someone's done that. But generally, it's a shorter time frame. So again, you've got the problem of time working against you because, to your point, these mental structures take time to build. One,
Yes.
then you've got the risk of choosing the right accounts, and
Right.
there is some intent data out there. I mean, there are providers that provide intent data. I think honestly, a lot of people have been questioning the quality of it, and
Mhm.
sometimes finding that even intent data versus just a good old cold target account list from a third party data provider can
Right.
work just as effectively. And so I think that's been throwing into the question of is it worth spending as much money as people are spending on some of these intent data providers to try to find the end market buyers? But I'm not necessarily opposed to using some type of data. I mean, if we see a signal out there in the market, it's certainly better than nothing. Does it mean it's a guarantee that someone's in market? Maybe not, but at
Right.
least it helps. But I think to your point, both those factors just make it challenging. Do you think there's a world though where both could live together? I mean, where you might have sort of a broader demand gen, brand marketing, more kind of targeting your whole entire ICP across the entire buying committee on sort of one peg of the strategy. And then another peg might be a very focused strategy, trying to pull accounts from that maybe show some intent or sensitive signals of interest, or would you disagree with that?
I think I'd have to sort of see more detail of that precise market situation. So it'll be a little bit difficult to say whether that's going to work or not.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, something we can come back to. You said something else too that was also quite interesting about on brand assets. And there's something else that has been um, always trending. This has been not a new thing by any stretch, but creating ads that don't look like ads.
Mhm.
And so this is where you get into folks that are leveraging all sorts of things like memes
Mhm.
or screenshots of their cell phone or a screenshot of a Slack comment of someone saying, "Hey, I really love your brand. I love working with them, et cetera, et cetera."
Mhm.
And I think this goes a big encounter sometimes to the typical advice that I know you all would agree with, and certainly Jenny. as well with regards to, the fact that we want to create memory structures around specific types of assets that are distinctive. And so if you start to pull away those distinctive assets, then you can sometimes get away from the whole memory structure building process, right? And then it becomes just a sea of content that, yes, maybe drives a higher engagement rate because it's native, it doesn't look like an ad, it has that feel. But I'd be curious, do you think there's a balance between doing, ads that don't look like ads, if you follow what I mean by that, versus ones that are kind of your typical on brand ad?
Um, I would say you want advertising that's watchable,
Yeah.
but you don't want to sacrifice correct brand. And I it's a bit of a false dichotomy, I think, perhaps to say, because certainly some ad agencies will say, we want to create entertaining, watchable advertising or content, and so therefore we have to strip down the amount of branding because we want to make it, you know, we want to make it look good.
Right.
But that's I think wrong thinking. There are plenty of examples of beautiful, creative executions that are also well branded and unmistakably, for a particular brand. And again, the breadth of distinctive assets, right? Like, distinctive assets don't have to be just the brand name or a, stylized font or a particular color. It can be
Mm.
all sorts of other, um, visual or audio, aspects of advertising that can create it, that can
Mm.
create correct branding without kind of some formulaic idea of it being boring.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's one of those things. It's use sparingly, right? I mean, I think that, ultimately the goal, and Gong is an example of a company that comes up to mind recently that I posted about some time ago. But their brand, some of their brand assets, the things that they use in their website. I'm talking about like the shapes and the icons and the topography and things like that. It really, I mean, it looks, you could take off all the copy from the ad and know it was them.
Right.
The copy doesn't even have to be there, right?
Mhm.
You just know it's there. Strip off the logo, strip off the headline. Just from the colors that they're using, the types of ways that they're putting it together, et cetera, that it's that brand. And so I think that given that we process visual information far faster than we do, written information, it just makes it a lot easier in the brain to say, boom, got it immediately. I know exactly who that is. I didn't read any message
Mhm.
whatsoever, which is not good. We clearly want them to, consume whatever the message or whatever we're trying to communicate as well. But if you can at least bypass that and say, hey, cool, at least we know we have the reference point of it's this brand. Cool. That's great. Now we've refreshed that memory structure. And then of course, if they, find the message interesting, et cetera, then they could, take the next step.
Yes. Of course, perhaps one final, uh, aspect of the 95/5 rule is that given that there are so many buyers who are not in market now and kind of they don't come into the market really very often at all,
Mm.
um, building distinctive assets is, a very long-term process. And so, a marketing team might mistakenly think, like our advertising, nobody could mistake it for anybody else. But it's worth checking, particularly among, that big pool of really infrequent buyers out there, because, they might be stunned to learn that it actually has quite low rates of recognition. So it's always worth checking.
Right. Right. 100%. 100%. It's a very good point. There's I didn't put this in the kind of our initial chat that we were going back and forth with, but you made me think of something that it was quite interesting, and it's a little bit of hotly debated thing in the world of social media and just in general between marketers. But as it relates to the 95/5 rule, we've got people that are out of market, people that are in market. Can advertising bring people in market,
Mhm.
or is the buyer bringing themselves in market? And I think this is one of these things that gets tossed around quite a bit on who's really doing that. Is this kind of the old argument of, can I get a persuasive ad in front of John and say, John, here's this thing. It's pretty interesting. You should check it out.
Yeah.
And then get you to go from a state of not having any problem or real need for it, and then having a need, and then saying, you know what, I'm going to go to the website and potentially at least evaluate this. Maybe it's not a a transactional type of product, but maybe something you still need to consider. Where,
Yeah.
where do you stand on that? Or is it not that black and white and it's a little bit more murky?
Yeah, good question. I think yeah. I think in some markets, advertising may be able to generate some demand. Like I think more consumer goods markets, because some categories can potentially substitute for others, and some categories are um, discretionary. So,
Mhm.
for argument's sake, um, you know, perhaps, some categories are perhaps competing against people not doing anything. So, like in Australia, for example, in summer, we have a big problem with mosquitoes. People
Mm.
like being outdoors, and but the problem is, dusk comes and you have hordes of mosquitoes. Um, Advertising for a mosquito repellent, in a sense, it could bring people into the market, right?
Right.
Um, or advertising for, mouthwash. I mean, we can
Right.
we can live without mouthwash,
Right.
but we could see some advertising that might kind of suggest to us, oh, maybe we should think about whether we've got bad breath, and so I might be,
Sure.
it's not going to bring everybody in the market, but it could.
Yeah.
B2B, not so sure that advertising can generate category demand. There are probably some categories that it could, or maybe it might encourage people to think about,
Mm.
upgrading or something like that. Certainly, some new, you know, in a sense, new categories might do this. So we had because I run I teach in an undergraduate teaching program, and we run a clinic for small businesses and not for profits, and
Okay.
we had a potential client who had written an AI based system for reconciling credit cards, and it was hugely labor saving.
Mm-hmm.
And so for them, I think advertising, in a sense, could, because it's in a sense it's a newish category. It's a new way or a different way of businesses organizing the way in which their staff reconcile credit cards. In a sense, you could say, well, advertising for that might stimulate category demand, because a finance director might say, wait, what, I can save like $200,000 a year on staff time, so that
Right.
people aren't, spending all this ridiculous amount of time reconciling credit cards. So it's
Yeah.
it's possible. Probably, in some cases, yes.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I don't know if it's completely black and white, that threshold. I think it's probably more. I tend to side with you a little bit more. So, I mean, the only example I can think of, there was a product called ClickCease, that at the time I had never heard about. They're owned by Check now, and they're a bot traffic detection tool. They block
Huh,
fraudulent clicks for the Google Ads, Facebook Ads, and other types of
nice.
platforms like that. And, before I got into advertising, I didn't really know a lot about bot traffic, didn't know that that was a thing. And so I do remember saying, I don't know if it was an ad or organic post or anything, but I saw some piece of content, and it was talking about the fact that, bot traffic and fraudulent clicks were taking something like 20 to 30% of your ad budget. And so it was really interesting. And so I read it, and I remember, going to the website and taking a look. And of course, after getting educated and doing a little more digging, then I said, well, holy shit. Like, I mean, if this is really a big issue, then we need to do something about this, especially for
Right.
all the clients we work with. So anyway, I think that's a moment where I didn't really necessarily have a problem because I was purely unaware that there was a problem. I think again, those cases are probably more rare. I mean, because most of the cases I can think of why I'm searching for a vendor is because I have a need, right? There's something that's happened, where there's a conversation that's happened internally at the company where we just simply do not want to do things the way that we're doing them right now, which leads to an investigation or evaluation of a tool. But there are those times though when there are things that I just haven't heard of, or it's a problem that I don't have as much awareness about, which again I think is probably a harder crowd to turn, where you can get some people that can see an advertisement, see a piece of content, see something, and say, well, "Wow, I never really knew that. I didn't know that was a thing. So let me take a look." So
Agreed. Yes, indeed.
yeah, yeah, it's interesting. Well, I know we're almost at time here. I wanted to give you back your morning, get some coffee or some breakfast or anything like that if you haven't had so already. But Anything that we didn't cover on the 95/5 rule that I didn't ask that you think is a really, really important distinction for people to make when thinking about using this practically, or just anything that maybe we haven't discussed?
I think we've covered it. I think,
Cool.
probably in closing, I would say, you know, remember that it's a heuristic, but, uh, go to the bother of calculating it for your own market, because
Mhm.
I think if you calculate it for your own market, I think it's a really powerful device to kind of get buy-in from, the other non-marketing stakeholders. I think that's,
Mm.
we talk about marketing, uh, sometimes struggling to justify itself to other parts of the business.
Mhm.
But I think, understanding the extent to which people are or are not in the market, and then also that related piece about consideration sets. I think those two things together, I think are really useful, simple things to communicate to, the CEO, the CFO, and so on, to help them to understand, why do we need to keep spending money on marketing? Because of these sorts of things.
I agree, and I think that just to again agree with that point. I mean, I think it is coming back. It's a heuristic. It's a rule of thumb. It is not a predictive forecasting tool that you're going to put into an Excel spreadsheet and then automatically know what you should do here in terms of budget splits. It's purely a framing mechanism for getting people that maybe do not understand how much budget they should be allocating to brand marketing or towards performance marketing to start thinking about the idea that, hey, there needs to be a balance between these two things because
Yeah.
there is a very small percent of people that are actually in market. And so if we have all of our budget focused just on those people, that means we're missing out on a lot of other people that have no clue who we are, that are going to be using memory structures first to think about a brand that comes to mind for a specific category. And if we're not in those areas where they're hanging out, whether that be LinkedIn, Facebook, or whatever social channel or email or events or you name it, if we're not in those channels creating some type of awareness, then we're going to have a really hard time converting some of that demand down funnel, and or we're going to end up paying the price or paying a lot more to Google Ads or Bing or some of these typical capture channels because everyone's competing in that world.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so to your point about familiarity, familiarity bias or the mere exposure effect, I mean, that's precisely why you spend so much advertising on these types of things. Because if I see a brand. I mean, this happened to me just the other day. I saw a brand on Google Ads. I can't remember the exact category. I think it was accounting, some bookkeeping accounting firms I was looking for. I just knew the name of this brand. I can't tell you how I knew it, but I knew the name and I didn't necessarily have like a good or positive vibe. I suppose it was neutral, but I knew of the brand
Right.
and it was enough for me to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to go evaluate, that product. And we ended up actually going with it, interestingly enough, mostly because we just didn't have enough time to evaluate a whole long list of vendors. But I think that's a great case for like, hey, the awareness was created somewhere else, but it was ultimately captured in a
Yes.
channel like Google.
Yes.
So
Yes. I think it's fair to say, just in closing, yeah, if there's a potential client out there, and what we're doing is chasing them once they're in the market,
right.
um, which would probably mean they haven't really heard of us before. And if we're
Mhm.
competing against some other vendor who they have heard of before, well, which one are they going to pick? Well, it's probably going to go to the one that they're more familiar with, because even B2B buyers kind of like get some reassurance from familiarity.
Yeah, I love that. That was a great ending. Well, I'd say we wrap it there. If anyone wanted to get in touch with you, is the best place LinkedIn, somewhere else? Are you active in other forums, chats, et cetera, that they could reach out to you if they wanted
I
to
think
learn more?
LinkedIn's the best way for sure.
LinkedIn.
Yes,
Well, great. Well, thanks so much for jumping on and so early again.
my
We'll
pleasure.
have to do this again maybe in the future on some other related topics. You guys have a
Indeed.
lot of great research. I enjoy it thoroughly. And I think it gives all us marketers a lot of more empirical data or some things that we can kind of come back on that seem more causal versus opinions and a lot of just conjecture that's out there in the world of LinkedIn. And so appreciate you kind of grounding us in some data there. So,
My pleasure. Okay.
all
Look
right.
forward to another session sometime.
I do too. All right. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks for listening to another episode of the Demand Podcast. Again, I'm Jonathan Bland, the co-founder of OmniLab. I'll also have with me Jason Steele, who's the other co-founder of OmniLab on this podcast as well. We're a demand gen agency for seed to Series B SaaS startups. If you like this episode or you're looking for some help with demand gen, please feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn over a DM, or you can go just directly to our website. That's omnilabconsulting.com. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you on the next episode where we'll be talking about all things demand gen. Until then, thanks. Bye-bye.